Welcome back to Life Among the Indians. We're today with Chapter 3, Part 1. During the progress of these wars, scenes of thrilling interest and of appalling savage barbarity were enacted. The record of some will be known only at the great day. Others are scattered along the history of those times, as so many monumental piles to tell us of what our fathers suffered that we might come into possession of this goodly land. But it must be confessed that these acts of savage cruelty were not all on the side of the Indians. Indeed, had the acts of the pioneers toward the Indians always been characterized by kind treatment and fair dealings, it is doubtful whether the savage cruelties inflicted on them would ever have occurred. To show that these statements are not unfounded, in fact, we will begin these narrations with one of the most cruel and tragic outrages ever perpetuated by mortal man, whether savage or professedly civilized. This was the butchery of the Moravian Indians by a party of whites in 1782. The Moravian missionaries, whose zeal is unquenched by the snows of Lapland, and whose energy braves the burning sands of Arabia and Africa, had penetrated these western wilds before the white man had made his settlement, and had succeeded in establishing missions on the Tuscarawas among the Delaware Indians. They had 3 stations on the river, namely Gnadenhutten, Schoenbrunn, and Salem. These villages were occupied by the Indians, all of whom had become Christianized and were peacefully engaged in various pursuits of civilization. Several depredations having been committed by hostile Indians about the time of which I am writing on the frontier inhabitants of the western Pennsylvania and Virginia, they determined to retaliate, and a company of 100 men was raised and placed under the command of Colonel Williamson as a corps of volunteer militia. They set out for the Moravian towns on the Tuscarawas River and arrived within a mile of Gnadenhutten on the night of the 5th of March. On the morning of the 6th, finding the Indians at work in their cornfield on the west bank of the river, 16 of Williamson's men crossed over, 2 at a time, in a large sugar trough, taking their rifles with them. The remainder went into the village, where they found an Indian and squaw, both of whom they killed. The 16 on the west side, on approaching the Indians, found them more numerous than they had anticipated. The Indians had their arms with them, which they carried not only for the purpose of protection, but for killing game. The whites accosted them kindly, telling them that they had come for the purpose of taking them to a place where in the future they would be protected in safety, no longer to be startled by the rude alarm of angry foes. They advised them to quit work and go with them to Fort Pitt. Some of the tribe had been taken to that place in the preceding year, and were treated with great kindness by their white neighbors, and especially the governor of the fort, and returned to their homes with tokens of friendship and kindness. Under such circumstances, it was not surprising that the most innocent and unsuspecting Moravian Indians surrendered their arms and at once consented to place themselves under the protection and control of Williamson and his men. An Indian messenger was dispatched to Salem for the purpose of apprising their brethren of the arrangement, and then both companies returned to Gnadenhutten. I know I'm saying that wrong. On reaching the village, a number of mounted militia started for the Salem settlement, but ere they reached it, so great was the dispatch of the messenger that they found the Moravian Indians at the place had already left their cornfields and were on the road to join their brethren. Measures had been previously adopted to secure the Indians, whom they had first decoyed into their power, and accordingly they were bound and confined in 2 houses, securely guarded. On the arrival of the Indians from Salem, their arms having been secured without any suspicion of their hostile intentions, they were at once seized, feted, and divided between the 2 prison houses, the males in one, the females in the other. The number thus confined in both houses, including men, women, and children, amounted to from 90 to 100. A council was then held to determine how the Moravian Indians should be disposed of. This self-constituted military court consisted of both officers and privates. Williamson put the question whether the Indians should be taken prisoners to Fort Pitt or put to death, requesting those who were in favor of saving their lives to march out of rank and form a second rank in advance. Only 18 out of the whole number stepped out as the advocates of mercy. In these, the feelings of humanity prevailed, but in the others, constituting a large majority, humanity and justice were utterly extinct. They had deliberately come to the conclusion to murder the whole of the Christian Indians in their power. Among the doomed were several who had contributed to the aid of the missionaries in the work of conversion and civilization, two of whom immigrated from New Jersey after the death of their pastor, the Reverend David Brainerd. One Indian female who could speak good English fell upon her knees before Williamson, the commander, and begged most eloquently and piteously for his protection, but all her supplications and pleadings were unheeded by the heartless and dastardly wretch who ordered her to prepare for death. They had anticipated the cruel fate that awaited them, and their hymns of praise and fervent prayers ascended from their prison during the whole of that eventful night to their great Father in heaven. Their prayers and tears and their pleadings for mercy and protection were lost upon their white murderers, but they entered the ears of an avenging God. When the morning sun arose, the work of death commenced, and a scene of human butchery occurred of sufficient enormity to move the heart most used to blood and carnage, and gather paleness on the cheek of darkness itself. One after another, men, women, and children were laid out to a block, prepared for the dreadful purpose, and, being commanded to sit down, the axe of the butcher, in the hands of infuriate demons, clave their skulls. Two persons who were present at that time, and who related to me the fearful story, assured me that they were unable to witness, but for a short time, that horrid scene. One of these men stated that when he saw the incarnate fiends lead a pretty little girl, about 12 years of age, to the fatal block, and heard her plead for her life in the most piteous accents, till her innocent voice was hushed in death, he felt a faintness come over him, and could no longer stand the heart-sickening scene. The dreadful work of human slaughter continued till every prayer and moan and sigh was hushed in the stillness of death. No sex, age, or condition was spared, from the gray-haired sire to the infant at its mother's breast. All fell victims to the most cold-blooded murder ever perpetrated by man. They lay in undistinguished confusion, gashed and gory, in that cellar where they were thrown by their butchers. Nearly 100 murdered Christian Indians, hurried to an untimely grave by those who had but 2 days before sworn to protect them. It was an act shocking to humanity, and its perpetrators should be consigned to eternal infamy. No wonder the Indians were excited to the highest pitch of fury, nor was the opportunity of revenge, a revenge that might have glutted the heart of an incarnate fiend, long waiting. The event narrated above took place on the 8th of March, 1782. On the 22nd of the succeeding May, the ill-fated Colonel Crawford headed another expedition from western Pennsylvania. The army consisted of 450 men, and commencing its march on the day above named, it proceeded due west, visiting in its way the Moravian towns which had just been the scene of such horrible tragedy. On the 6th of June, when near the upper Sandusky, they were attacked by the Indians and defeated. At least 100 were killed and taken prisoner, and of the latter it is said that only 2 escaped. When the rout commenced, instead of retreating in a body, they fled in small parties and thus fell an easy prey into the hands of their pursuers. Colonel Crawford became separated from the main body of his soldiers by his extreme anxiety for his son and 2 or 3 other relations, whom he suspected were in the rear, and therefore waited for them an unreasonable time. He at length fled in the company of Dr. Knight and 2 others. Unfortunately, after traveling nearly 2 days, they were with several others surprised by a party of Delawares and conducted to the old Wyandotte town. Here, Captain Pipe, a celebrated Delaware chief, painted both Crawford and Knight black. As they were conducted towards the town, the captives observed the bodies of 4 of their friends tomahawked and scalped. This was regarded as a sad presage. In a short time, they overtook the 5 prisoners who remained alive. They were seated on the ground and surrounded by a crowd of Indian squaws and boys who taunted and menaced them. Crawford and Knight were compelled to sit down apart from the rest, and immediately afterwards the doctor was given to a Shawnee warrior to be conducted to their town. The boys and squaws then fell upon the other prisoners and tomahawked them in a moment. Crawford was then driven toward the village, Gritty accompanying the party on horseback. At the village resided an Indian chief named Wingemund. This chief had been known to Crawford some time before, and had been on terms of true friendship with him, and kindly entertained him was entertained by him at his own house, and such acts of kindness all red men remember with gratitude. Winged Nund does not appear to have been present when the first preparations were made for burning the prisoners, but resided not far from the fatal spot, and had retired to his cabin that he might not see the sentence of his nation executed upon one calling him his friend. But Crawford requested that he might be sent for, cheering his almost rayless mind with the faint hope that he would interpose and save him. Accordingly, Wingendund soon appeared in the presence of the bound and naked white man. He was asked by Crawford if he knew him, who said he believed he did, and asked, "Are you not Colonel Crawford?" "I am," replied the colonel. The chief discovered much agitation and embarrassment, and ejaculated, "So yes, indeed. Do you not recollect the friendship that always existed between us, and that we were always glad to see each other?" said Crawford. "Yes," said the chief, "I remember all this, and that we have often drank together, and that you have been kind to me." "Then I hope," added Crawford, "the same friendship will still continue." "It would, of course," said the chief, "were you where you ought to be, and not here." "And why not here?" asked the colonel. "I hope you would not desert a friend in time of need. Now is the time for you to exert yourself on my behalf, as I should do for you were you in my place." "Colonel Crawford," replied the chief, "you have placed yourself in a situation which puts it out of my power, and that of others of your friends, to do anything for you." How so, chief?" said the colonel. And he added, "By joining yourself to the execrable man Williamson and his party, the man who but the other day murdered such a number of the Moravian Indians, knowing them to be friends, knowing that he ran no risk in murdering a people who would not fight, and whose only business was praying. But I assure you, chief," said Crawford, "that had I been with him at that time, this would not have happened. Not I alone, but all your friends, and all good men, wherever they are, reprobate acts of this kind." "That may be," said the chief, "yet these friends, these good men, did not prevent him from going out again to kill the remainder of those inoffensive yet foolish Moravian Indians. I say foolish because they believed the whites in preference to us. We had often told them that they would be one day so treated by those people who call themselves their friends. We told them that there was no faith to be placed in what the white men said, that their fair promises were only intended to allure us, that they might the more easily kill us, as they have done many Indians before they killed these Moravians." "I am sorry to hear you speak thus," said Crawford. "As to Williamson's going out again, when it was not known that he was determined on it, I went out with him to prevent him from committing fresh murders." "This," said the chief, "the Indians would not believe, were even I to go and tell them so." Crawford then asked, "And why would they not believe it?" "Because," replied the chief, "it would have been out of your power to prevent his doing what he pleased." "Out of my power?" exclaimed the colonel, and asked, "Have any Moravian Indians been killed or hurt since we came out?" "None," answered the chief, "but you went first to their town, and finding it empty and deserted, you turned on the path toward us. If you had been in search of warriors only, you would not have gone thither. Our spies watched you closely. They saw you while you were embodying yourselves on the other side of the Ohio. They saw you cross that river. They saw where you encamped at night. They saw you turn off from the path to the deserted Moravian town. They knew you were going out of your way. Your steps were consistently watched, and you were suffered quietly to proceed till you reached the spot where you were attacked." Crawford, doubtless with this sentence, ended his last rays of hope. He asked with faint emotion, "What do they intend to do with me?" And when the chief frankly replied, "I tell you with grief, as Williamson, with his whole cowardly host, ran off in the night, at the whistling of our warriors' balls, being satisfied that now he had no Moravians to deal with, but men could fight, and with such he did not wish to have anything to do, I say, as he escaped, and they have taken you, they will take revenge on you in his stead." "And is there no possibility of preventing this?" asked Crawford. "Can you devise no way to get me off? You shall, my friend, be well rewarded if you are instrumental in saving my life." "Had Williamson taken with you," answered the chief, "I and some friends, by making use of what you have told me, might, perhaps, have succeeded in saving you. But as the matter now stands, no man would dare to interfere in your behalf. The King of England himself, were he to come to this spot with all his wealth and treasure, could not effect this purpose. The blood of the innocent Moravians, more than half of them women and children, cruelly and wantonly murdered, calls aloud for revenge. The relatives of the slain, who are among us, cry out and stand ready for revenge. The nation to which they belonged will have revenge. The Shawnees, our grandchildren, have asked for your fellow prisoners. On him they will take revenge. All the nations connected with us cry out, revenge, revenge. The Moravians, whom you went to destroy, having fled, instead of avenging their brethren, the offense is become national, and the nation itself is bound to take revenge." "My fate then is fixed," said the wretched man, "and I must prepare to meet death in the worst form." "Yes, Colonel," replied the chief, "I am sorry for it, but cannot do anything for you. Had you intended to the Indian principle, that as good and evil cannot dwell together in the same heart, so a good man ought not to go into evil company, you would not be in this lamentable situation. You see, now, when it is too late, after Williamson has deserted you, what a bad man he must be. Nothing now remains for you but to meet your fate like a brave man. Farewell, Colonel Crawford. They are coming. I will retire to a solitary spot." And having said these words, he withdrew. It is said that the chief shed tears at parting with his former friend. The preparations for the horrible tragedy were soon completed. A large stake was driven into the ground, and piles of dry wood heaped around it. Colonel Crawford's hands were then tied behind his back. A strong rope was produced, one end of which was fastened to the ligatures between his wrists, and the other to the bottom of the stake. The rope was long enough to permit him to walk around the stake several times and then return. Fire was then applied to the hickory poles, which lay in piles at the distance of 6 or 7 yards from the stake. The colonel, observing these terrible preparations, called to Gertie, who sat on horseback at the distance of a few yards from the fire, and asked if the Indians were going to burn him. Gertie replied in the affirmative. The colonel heard the intelligence with firmness, merely observing that he would bear it with a fortitude. When the hickory poles had been burned asunder, in the middle, Captain Pipe arose and addressed the crowd in a tone of great energy, and with animated gestures, pointing frequently to the colonel, who regarded him with an appearance of unruffled composure. As soon as he had ended, a loud whoop burst from the assembled throng, and they all rushed once upon the unfortunate Crawford, and for several seconds the crowd was so great around him that Knight could not see what they were doing, but in a short time they had dispersed sufficiently to give him a view of the colonel. His ears had been cut off, and the blood was streaming down each side of his face. A terrible scene of torture now commenced. The warriors shot charges of powder into his naked body, commencing with the calves of his legs and continuing to his neck. The boys snatched the burning hickory poles and applied them to his flesh. As fast as he ran around the stake to avoid one party of tormentors, he was prominently met at every turn by others, with burning poles, red-hot irons, and rifles loaded with powder only, so that in a few minutes nearly 100 charges of powder had been shot into his body, which had become black and blistered in a dreadful manner. The squaws would take up a quantity of coals and hot ashes and throw them upon his body, so that in a few minutes he had nothing but fire to walk upon. In the extremity of his agony, the unhappy colonel called aloud upon Gritty in tones which rang through Knight's brain with maddening effect. "Gritty, Gritty, shoot me through the heart, quick, quick. Do not refuse me. Don't you see I have no gun, Colonel?" replied the renegade, bursting into a laugh, and then turning to an Indian beside him, he uttered some brutal jests upon the naked and miserable appearance of the prisoner. And while this awful scene was being acted, Gertie rode up to the spot where Dr. Knight stood, and told him that he now had a foretaste of what was in reserve for him at the Shawnee towns. He swore that he needed not expect to escape death, but should suffer it in all the extremity and torture. Knight, whose mind was deeply agitated at the sight of the fearful scene before him, took no notice of Gertie, but preserved an impenetrable silence. Gertie, after contemplating the colonel's sufferings for a few moments, turned again to Knight, and indulged in a bitter invective against a certain Colonel Gibson, for whom he said he had received deep injury, and dwelt upon the delight with which he would soon see him undergo such tortures as those which Crawford was then suffering. He observed in a taunting tone that most of the prisoners had said that the white people would not injure him, if the chance of war was to throw him into their power, but that for his own part he should loathe to try the experiment. I think, he added with a laugh, that they would roast me alive with more pleasure than those red fellows are now broiling the colonel. So what is your opinion, Doctor? Do you think they would be glad to see me? Still Knight made no answer. In a few minutes, Gertie rejoined the Indians. The terrible scene had now lasted more than 2 hours, and Crawford had become much exhausted. He walked slowly around the stake, spoke low in a tone, and earnestly besought God to look with compassion upon him and to pardon his sins. His nerves had lost much of their sensibility, and he no longer shrunk from the firebrands with which they instantly touched him. At length he sunk in a fainting fit upon his face, and lay motionless. Instantly an Indian sprung upon his back, kneeled lightly upon one knee, made a circular incision with his knife upon the crown of his head, and clapping the knife between his teeth, tore the scalp off with both hands. Scarcely had this been done when a withered hag approached with a board full of burning embers, and poured them upon the crown of his head, now laid bare to the bone. The colonel groaned deeply, arose, and walked again slowly around the stake. But why continue a description so horrible? Nature at length could endure no more, and at late hour in the night he was released by death from the hands of his tormentors. Whether Gertie really took pleasure in the torture of Colonel Crawford, or was forced by circumstances to enjoy it, is a question which historians have generally been in too much haste to determine. It is well known that at the time of Crawford's expedition, the Indians were very much exasperated by the cold-blooded slaughter of the Moravian red men, an atrocity without a parallel in border warfare, and to have seemed merciful to the whites for a single moment would have been fatal to Gertie. Indeed, it is said that when he spoke of ransoming the colonel, Captain Pike threatened him with death at the stake. Let justice be rendered even to the worst of criminals. And I'll leave off Chapter 3, Part 1 there. I hope you'll subscribe if you've not done so yet, and be watching for the announcement of Chapter 3, Part 2 soon. Thanks for listening. God bless, and have a great day.